Hello and welcome. Today we've got another default versus custom setup. Today we're using the CopA Classic 1965 Mini Cooper S, and we'll be chasing my current world record ghost of 144.646. The first run we do will be using the Razor default settings untouched, and that will be our baseline run. And then the subsequent runs after that, for each one we will change one item of the setup to then match my world record ghost setup. And as the runs progress, we should see ourselves edge closer and closer and closer to the ghost. But before we get on track, let's just go and have a quick look at the two setups and see how they actually compare. So straight away, the thing that jumps out to me here is the tyre pressures are sky high compared to what I run them at. The brake pressure is very low and the brake bias is quite far forwards. So that's the tyres, brakes and chassis. In the suspension, the cast is actually the same. The camber, it has got more negative front camber. Front ride height is the same. Front springs are stiffer. The front damping is the same. The rear camber is less than what we run. The rear ride height is the same, and the rear spring is softer. Their steering lock is a little bit less than what we run, but we saw that with the JCW. That's quite a powerful change, that, so that'll be interesting. It's got a lot of toe out on it. It's got a stiffer front roll bar. It's got more rear toe in by a fraction, and it's got a stiffer rear bar as well. In the drivetrain with this Mini, there isn't anything here that can make any difference other than the fuel map, but it's TT, so you're going to run, you know, the rich fuel mixture. But for completeness, I might well do a comparison for rich, medium, and lean fuel mixtures later in the video. We'll see. Right, so without further ado, let's get trackside and let's go see how this default setup compares to the Ghost. Great. The rear of the car is very nervous. Ugh. It's very difficult to place. I wouldn't want to race it, that's for sure. Just constantly biting the back of the car. Well, I reckon there's another couple of tenths in there at least. I reckon, but it's quite indicative though. I mean, it's a fair reflection of how the car feels. it's just really it just feels really awkward. It feels like it's two completely different cars for low speed and high speed. So in the high speed, it doesn't actually feel too bad. The front of the car stays sort of relatively stable, and the rear of the car sort of kind of matches it. But as soon as you get into the low speed, it just the rear of the car just becomes really, really unstable on the brakes, and it's almost like it's just waiting for you to trust it, and then it will go, ha ha ha, gotcha. So let's get into the setup. Unfortunately, we can't access the setup from this screen, so we have to keep restarting the session, which is a bit of a shame. I don't believe it was like that last time. Right, so let's get into the setup. So first things first, I am going to knock those tyre pressures down, because I don't think it's just because I know that they're high, but the car feels like it's bouncing around a lot. So I'm going to literally run it as low as you can on the front, and the rear is 1.65. That's how much difference there is. Yeah, the thick end of 0.3, 0.4 bar, which is about, what's that? It's knocking on like 6, 7 psi. It's massive. I don't know why they're so high. So let's get out there and let's try it with the lower tyre pressures. Much better. Much better on the brakes. Rear of the car is much more stable now. Still losing a little bit of drive up the hill, aren't we? That's a big improvement, that, isn't it? Yes, that's a big improvement. So we've gone from a 45.4, is it 45? Yeah, so 45.4 to 45.1. That's a big change. So you can see that. I mean, I don't think I even need to really say it, but I will anyway. The rear of the car is so much more stable with the tyre pressures down. It's, yeah, and that will help you in the race as well. So it's just a win-win situation, really. So where do we go from here? Well, I think we may as well just work through the pages, really. So I think, I mean, 90% brake pressure, I could probably lock the front wheels up. So the brake pressure, I don't think it's going to make it any faster. It just means I've got to modulate a bit more carefully. But we may as well increase that to 100. I don't see that being a big setup. You know, it's not going to affect the lap time, I don't think, too much in this car. In the JCW, it does, because you can use 100% of your brake power, whereas In this, you can't. But let's give that a go now. Right, let's get on track with 100% brake power. Interesting. Okay, so what it has done is highlight that the front brake bias is too high. Interesting. It's just a bit slower. Okay, so that's interesting. It's a little bit slower than it was with the 90%. However, I know that come the end, it'll be faster with 100%. So we're going to leave it as 100. But what it has done is highlight that the front brake bias is too far forwards. So, and I think that's probably why it's a little bit slower, because now I'm on the brakes, I can lock that front wheel much easier. And I did snatch it a little bit going into the hairpin. So I think that's a next thing to do now. So let's go and move that brake bias rearwards. So I have mine at 77. Let's go and give that a go and see how that fares. So it's reintroduced a little bit of the waywardness at the back of the car again now. But it does feel like it's making better use of the higher braking power. We're back in the 0.1s again. Yeah, so we're back in the 0.1s, which, so our second run was a 192. This is a 135. So nearest, damn it. We're about where we were after we just did the tyre pressures. So we've increased the braking power and we've reduced the front brake bias a little bit, moved it rearwards a little bit. So that's the first page actually now. That's as much as we can do, but the car is still, it's still not very nicely balanced. It's still doing understeer and oversteer and a mixture of the two. And it's still a little bit snappy. It's still trying to catch you out. So with that rear brake bias increase, it's where it needs to be, along with the brake pressure. But maybe they weren't the changes that it needed at that time, I would say. So they're probably best done in conjunction with something else to make the most of them. So I suspect we'll see that come into play later on. So the caster is actually the same as the world record anyway. So let's drop the cambers now. So I run my front camber as little as I can, and I run my rear camber as much as I can. And the reason I do that is because, and this might not be the reason why in terms of the physics of the game, but the reason I do that is because I believe it helps with the inside front wheel, keeping that flatter. I would rather sacrifice a little bit of the outside front wheel's grip so that I can increase the inside, the unloaded wheel's grip, because we don't have a locked diff. We don't have any reason, we have no means of making the outside wheel do more of the driving forces. So the inside wheel is doing all of that, and I want to help that as much as I possibly can. So I want to give it as much contact patch as possible. On the rear of the car, I don't want the outside of the outside rear wheel. I don't want it running on the outer edge. I want it running as flat as possible. And as the chassis rolls, you know, it's gonna, if you don't have any camber on the car at all, it's gonna run on the outer edge of the rear wheel, and it's just not going to work well. So you need to increase the camber on the rear. There's no way you can run it at 0 and be the fastest. It's just, no, it doesn't make any sense. So yeah, -2, or as little as possible on the front, -1 on the rear, as much as possible. Right, let's get on track and see how the cambers help. This will be the telling corner. Will the ghost creep away? Ever so slightly, but not by much, is it? That's more like it. Right. So it's not it's not night and day. It's a subtle change. It's one of those ones that you'd probably go, well, actually, I can kind of feel like it is sacrificing the. You can feel it sacrificing the outer wheel, um, especially in the fast left that heads up towards the hairpin. You feel it sacrificing the outside wheel where it's almost like it is running more on the outer edge, but then it pays you back plus a little bit extra in the slower stuff. And the run up to the hill as well, coming out of the chicanes, and also the hairpin a little bit. It certainly helped coming out of the hairpin. Definitely did help coming out of the hairpin. But the hairpin's so difficult because it's so dependent on how you set the car up for it. But the right hander that takes you up the hill is probably more indicative because it's much more consistent to get right. So the run up the hill, the Ghost just didn't edge away anywhere near as much as it did before. So yeah, and I've got an inkling as to why that is, but we'll get to that setup change later on, and then hopefully that will then really show up the last little piece of the puzzle, I would have thought. But right, so what's next then? So let's restart this, and let's get back into the setup. Advanced suspension. Right, so we've done cambers. Ride height's the same. So let's now do the springs. So they run it quite stiff at the front, which to me, this is probably the biggest cause of the understeer, oversteer. The weight's never really quite where I want it to be. This is the biggest cause of that for me. So I run this car as soft as I can on the front because it seems to be naturally stiff. It's not like the vintage touring car Mini, which is super duper soft and just needs to be a lot stiffer. This has gone the other way. This is naturally super stiff and probably needs to have its range moved a bit softer. So I run the front of the car very, very soft, and I run the rear of the car a little bit stiff. So, there's only two spring rates for the rear. It's worth mentioning, and you've got 6 for the front, and I run literally 1 on the front and 2 at the rear. Now, that will. The biggest thing I found here is just that it really helps with tyre wear. It might not ultimately be faster on a single lap, but over the course of a race, having the spring rate at 1 really does help the front of the car out in the latter stages of any given stint on a set of tyres. And oddly, the spring rate being 2 at the rear helps the front of the car because the rear of the car is not rolling as much and it doesn't pitch the inside wheel quite as high. It doesn't, so the inside front corner of the chassis stays flatter. It's kind of like using it like an anti-roll bar for the front of the car. But again, I'm going to say this. I'm going to put this caveat in a lot of places. It's not necessarily what's actually happening, but it's how it feels to me as a driver. So I use the rear spring rate to help control or keep the front of the car a little bit flatter without the need for running the front of the car stiffer. And that seems to give a really nice benefit. Anyway, let's get trackside and let's go and see how those spring rate changes have helped. There's a bit of time in that Ghost. Nice. Still got a bit of understeer. We're not there yet. So 0.8 now. But the car doesn't feel right still. So the car still feels very very lazy on the front, especially at the apex. It needs some work on that. So let's go and jump into that. Oh, not that. Restart. That was close. Whew. Right. Advanced. So, caster, camber, ride height's the same, spring rate's now the same, damping is the same anyway. So, next one is... Now, I would... Let's do the toe angles next. No. No, because that's not where the problem is. The problem is in the anti-roll bars. So, yes, toe angle is the next one in terms of logical order, in terms of the order on the screen, but the problem is the balance of the car is too towards understeer. So I run the front roll bar as low as I can, and I run the rear roll bar as low as I can. And the reason I do that, especially on the front, is because, again, all about that inside front wheel. I don't want anything getting in the way of that inside front wheel being allowed to move and move freely. And yes, a front anti-roll bar will keep the front of the car flatter, and in theory can keep more weight on the inside front wheel. But when I run a front anti-roll bar, it feels like, to me, like the inside wheel is almost being, that in order to keep the front of the car flatter, it's taking pressure off the inside wheel. And it just doesn't feel right. It feels like it always feels like it takes away traction, and it feels like you're better off allowing the front of the car to roll a little bit, but give that inside wheel freedom of movement. And I find that the anti-roll bar at the rear, if I run that stiffer, it doesn't have the same effect as when I run the spring rate stiffer. The anti-roll bar at the rear seems to, if I increase that, it seems to make the rear of the car a bit more slidey at the point of turning. It doesn't support the rear of the car like the rear spring rate does. So I've found 1 and 1 on the anti-roll bar just to be the nicest compromise. So let's get that saved. And then let's go get on track. That a little bit. Just miss the apex there a little bit. rear of the car just feels a bit too locked in for my liking. We're getting there, aren't we? Is that an 816? Where were we before? We were 882. So we're a little bit faster, but not by much. It's a fairly subtle change. It's actually not as big a change as I thought it was going to be. I was expecting it to be a bigger change than that. But the rear of the car feels just a little bit too locked in now. So let's get into the setup. Let's see what's left. So we've got the toe angles, front and rear. Now that is, I mean, 1 degree of toe out is a lot. So let's drop that down to -2, and the rear we're going to drop down to 0.1. Sorry, -0.2 and then positive 0.1. So the rear's got a bit of toe in, and the front has just got a little bit of toe out. Now you generally use a bit of toe out on the front because when, especially on a front wheel drive car, because when you put the torque through the front wheels, they tend to pull in towards being towed in slightly. As it's pulling the car forwards, they sort of do that, and they straighten up a little bit. So you have a little bit of toe out, just so that to compensate, so that when they're under torque, they're sort of straight ahead. Right, let's give that a go and see how that works. Feels nice now. That's good. Right. Now we've got a balance that we can play with, we can work with. Now it feels like I could do with just a bit more steering lock. Yeah. Easy on the engine there, Andrew. Yeah, that was a nice change, that. So, again, all these changes are subtle. There's no quantum leaps here. They're all little tiny increments. But that felt nicer. So, the front of the car didn't feel as... didn't quite feel as aggressive and weird. It just felt more consistent, like it was more drivable, rather than being grabby. And the rear of the car just had a bit more freedom just to do what it had to do. So yeah, that was nice. That was a good change. So the only change that's left now is to increase the steering lock, and so my record time is a 29 degrees steering lock. So this now is exactly as per the world record ghost we've been chasing this whole time. Let's give that a quick save. and let's go see if we can go and match it. That's close enough for me. Yeah, so as you can see, so we're near as damn it, we're there. Yeah, happy days. Right, so let's have a quick deco through the setup again. So we've changed our tyres, we've changed our brake pressure, we've changed our brake bias. The caster stayed the same, the camber was changed, the ride height stayed the same, the spring rate changed, the damping on the front stayed the same. Our steering lock was increased, our toes were adjusted, and our anti-roll bars were adjusted. So pretty much everything that we can change, bar a couple of small things. I mean, and the ride heights, just to put it into perspective. So you got a choice of 100 or 101 millimeters for the front, 115 or 116 millimeters ride height. I'm not even really sure why they're even enabled for a 1 millimeter change. That seems a bit odd to me. But anyway, yeah. So that's it. So I think what I should do now, I would like to do a comparison run now between rich fuel, medium fuel, and lean fuel, just so you can see the difference between those two, so that when I'm doing my races, you can also see how much difference those are making. So let's get into that now. Let's go into the drivetrain. Well, actually, I can just do that on the fly actually, because I've got a maps button on my wheel. So we'll do that on the fly. Right. See you on track. We just see it creeping away from us on the straights. Easy. Just see it, especially on the hills. That's very cool to see it. Right, let's run it down some low fuel now. Right, now on low fuel. You really see it when you're accelerating up the hill. I mean, look at the difference, it's massive. And you see how much you're overreaching, you're starting to like cut corners, trying to make up the difference. And a bit of desperation almost. So we did a, where are we? So the session best was a 45.0. The previous lap was a 45.6. So we dropped 0.4 to normal fuel, and then we dropped a further 0.5, 0.6. Yeah, so lean's basically you're dropping a second with lean and half a second. So so you drop half a second with every step on this circuit. Interesting. Right, let's get into the summary, shall we? Well, I'm very glad I've done that. That was quite a telling process to go through. I kind of wish I'd done it a bit sooner, really. So the car setup that I've arrived at has happened over lots and lots of races, and trying to sort of just fine-tune the little characteristics that I didn't really like in the car. And over the course of time, you don't realise how much of them you're actually resolving until you come back and you do a full reset and a full comparison. So I'm actually really, really glad that this has come about. If you'd have given me the default car setup, if I'd have gone to a brand new team in real life and you'd given me the car as per the default setup, I would have questioned where they've spent all their money. The car was it was difficult to place, it was difficult to drive consistently, the rear of the car kept snapping around, the front of the car kept drifting wide, but the rear was worse than the front. It was different between fast and slow corners. It was just like there's very little right about it, and there was a lot of work to do. And alright, we've smashed it out because we know what the known values are at the end of the process, but to work out that over the period of time, the trial and error involved is quite large. I don't use telemetry, I'm not an engineer, I don't pretend to be an engineer. I do everything by what my mind's eye thinks it's seeing. You know, it tries to. So in my head, I've got a car that's kind of like a little model car, and it's being pitched and it's being rolled and it's being yawed and sliding around, and I imagine what the suspension's doing and what the transmission is doing within those boundaries. And in my mind's eye, over the period of time, trial and error, because you try something, it doesn't work, and you go, oh, okay, I've got that a bit wrong then. Okay, let's try something else. Let's try it the other way. And you, oh, okay, right. So it's a long old process to go through. If you were an engineer, it'd be a lot quicker because you could just look at the telemetry and you would understand what you're looking at. I don't understand what I'm looking at with that, and in all honesty, I don't really want to understand it because I like doing it the old-fashioned way. So, yeah, the default setup was just under 0.8 of a second slower than the custom. So I must be doing something right somewhere. But more importantly than the outright speed, the custom setup is far easier to place on the circuit. It's far easier to race. It's much more stable, but yet also more directional. It holds its line nicer. It brakes better. That, you know, it's as a race car, let alone a qualifying car, it's just night and day better. I'm actually really quite pleased with it. Probably more so than the JCW, actually. The other bonus that comes with it is that it's better on tyres. So over the course of a stint, it's also faster. So there isn't a single area where the custom setup is worse than the default one. I can't think of one. And you can dissect it, and yeah, I'm really struggling to think why you would ever, unless you had to run default, why you'd ever run the default values. For me, the priority in the setup for this car has always been the inside front corner. And the reason for that is because it's, as far as corner processes go, the exit, so the apex to exit phase, is by far and away the weakest for this car. And the main reason for that is because it doesn't have an adjustable diff. It's got an open diff on it, and when you're on a lock, I always pretend it's on the right hand lock, but when you're on a lock, the inside front wheel is doing all the driving, and everything hinges on that. The exit you get generally hinges on how much traction that inside front wheel has got, and the default setup just sacrifices too much of it in favour of trying to gain apex speed. Now that can help you, because the apex, if you start off from a higher speed, then you haven't got such a amount of speed to build up, so it can help you. But in the case of the default setup, the inside wheel just has so little traction that it can't use it. And also, apart from anything else, you're not going faster anyway, because the default setup is so badly balanced that you're going slower. So it's an absolute killer. So basically, it's the worst of both worlds. You're either slower or about the same on the apex speed, and then you've got less traction on that inside wheel, so you can't get out of the corner. So there's a lot of changes made, and a lot of it sacrifices. Sorry, not sacrifices. A lot of it is about balancing the car for cornering grip and traction. And with the front of the car, the cambers especially is a great example for that. So the cambers especially they're a compromise, especially on the front of the car. I could run more front camber, and I could gain a bit of cornering speed, but then I'd lose traction. So it's a real, it's a give and take scenario. I think there's a bit more speed in the car still. I think there's a bit more to find, but I'm not going to invest in it just yet. I'm going to carry on working, keep doing races, and see how I get on. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you liked what you've seen, please consider liking and subscribing. And until the next time, we'll see you later.